So we have two great guests with us today, and they're going to talk to us about the Afghan Refugee Resettlement Program. So welcome them, please.
Well, thank you, Greg, and Jack and I are going to take our masks off since we're far from you all and a little bit apart from one another. But Greg, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here with my Westminster family and with my longtime friend, former boss, amazing mentor, and fantastic Delawarean, Jack Markell. And as Greg mentioned, I think we're all really excited to be here, given Westminster's longstanding work in this area. And we're lucky to have Jack here because this has been a very busy year for you. You were appointed by President Biden to serve as the United States ambassador to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So he's going to move to Paris for a while. But while your nomination was pending before the United States Senate, President Biden also appointed you as the pitch hitter of the administration to serve as the White House coordinator for Operations Allies Welcome. And in that time, you have helped resettle, I believe, more than 75,000 Afghan allies in states across the country. And obviously, there's a lot of our understanding around this centered on the news coverage around the evacuation, but this effort is about so much more than that. It's about, seems to be building a home and a community for people and their families here. And so, can you tell us a bit about what Operation Allies Welcome is and the work that you do?
Sure. First, let me thank you all for having me. Greg, thank you very much. To the congregation, I have a lot of friends sitting in front of me, and it's great to see all of you. And it's certainly great to be with Sarah, who makes all of us really, really proud of the work that you're doing in Dover. And I can say, and I firmly believe it, I never would have been governor without her support and the dozens and dozens of young people that she recruited to my campaign back in 2007, 2008. So Operation Allies Welcome, and I do want to say thank you to Westminster for the work that you are doing to sponsor some Afghan families. And I know some of them are here today, and it's wonderful to be with you. It has been awe-inspiring to see firsthand the generosity of the American people. And when you get out into the country, blue and red really don't make much of a difference. And I hope I'll have a chance to talk more about that. So the Operation Allies Welcome, normally the White House would not be really all that involved in the effort to help resettle our allies from overseas. We have a regular refugee program that is primarily led by the State Department. Really talented, wonderful people at the State Department. In this case, because it was a lot of folks all at once and just the way that it went down, a number of agencies are involved. The Department of Homeland Security is actually the lead operating federal agency. The Department of Defense has been involved because virtually all of the Afghans who have arrived in the United States have spent some time on one of 8 different U.S. military bases before they're resettled in the communities across the country. The State Department has been involved as well. So far, we've resettled about 55,000 of our allies from Afghanistan. We've got about another 20,000 to go who are still on one of 5 military bases. We've been able to close 3 of them so far. And we are working as quickly as we can to do it as well as we can. The Department of Defense has done an incredible job. I've now been, and Senator Carper, who I just saw on the highway, he and I went in a hallway. Senator Carper and Senator Coons and I went a few weeks ago up to Fort Dix in New Jersey. It was my second time at Fort Dix. That's the biggest base where our allies from Afghanistan are staying before they are resettled into communities across the country. It's an enormous job. I mean, if you think about it, let's put ourselves in the shoes of our allies who are arriving here. And we know the single most important thing that we can do is set them up for long-term success, which means getting them resettled into communities, getting them connected to jobs, getting their kids enrolled in schools, making them feel welcome. And this is an incredible undertaking. And for me to be a small part of it as the White House coordinator. It's really making sure that all of the agencies within the U.S. government are working together well, but also what the President said to me, he said, we want to make sure we provide a safe and dignified welcome, and he asked me to lead not just the whole of U.S. government welcome, but a whole of America welcome. And so the chance to work with the resettlement agencies, with all of the other nonprofits, with business leaders, with universities and colleges. About 3 weeks ago, I was at Bard College, small college south of Albany. Bard College alone is welcoming 100 students from Afghanistan with tuition-free scholarships. And so we went there to thank them and also to host a roundtable where we got commitments from dozens of universities and colleges across the country to do similar things. So, long answer to your question, but that sort of gives an overview. We will continue to receive our allies from Afghanistan. We're expecting about 2,000 a month more over the next, through the end of the fiscal year, and then there will be more over time. Many of our families, I assume it's probably true with the families here, still have folks left behind in Afghanistan or in some other country in Europe or the Middle East, and we know how important it is to them that there's family reunification. People are working on that, but that will take a period of time.
Well, a whole of America approach requires an in-depth answer, so thank you for that. You know, I want to sort of step back and really ground the conversation in the individual experiences of the Afghan allies who are now here. And so you mentioned that you've already, I think, closed out, you said 3 bases in terms of getting our allies into communities outside of them. For a person or a family, once they arrive here, what does that journey look like? What's that timeline? What's that process?
So let me step back and say what the journey looks like from leaving Afghanistan. And you know, you've probably seen, I'm sure you've seen some of the coverage of what that looked like and the stories at the airport. For all the folks that I'm referring to, that's really where it started. When they left Afghanistan, none of them came directly to the United States. They went to one of a number of U.S. military bases in Europe or the Middle East. Before they were allowed to get on a plane to come to the United States, they went through through a security process, a vetting process, basically checking to make sure they were sort of tested against a number of databases for security and vetting before they could get on a plane. Some of them just spent a few days in Europe or the Middle East. Some, there's still several thousand incoming, for example. When they arrived in the United States, they arrived either at Dulles or in Philadelphia. Now, for the last couple of months, everybody's been coming into the Philadelphia airport. And from there, the first thing is they're given a COVID test. If they had COVID, they were quarantined. If not, they would then be quickly routed to one of 8 U.S. military bases. So Fort Dix, I mentioned, Fort Dix still has more than 10,000 of our allies from Afghanistan. We closed down Quantico, we closed down Fort Lee, we closed down, I think, one of the others, but there's still 5 that are open, but we expect by the end of January another couple of those to be closed as we sort of move people along. We would prioritize those who were in medically fragile condition. A lot of the folks who came, first of all, there were, as you probably know, many of the Afghans have very large families. And so it will not surprise you to know that many of the women were pregnant when they came. And so we have prioritized the resettlements of women in advanced stages of pregnancy, as well as those dealing with other medical issues to the point where they were medically fragile. Because if you think about it, many of our military bases are located in communities where there's not a big hospital center, a big health center nearby. And so there was a huge burden on the part of the Department of Defense to try to help these folks either at the base or in local hospitals. And so it's much better to be able to resettle them in the communities across the country. So they're at the military bases, and this is really where the the issue begins about how is a decision made where they're going to be resettled across the country. So many of our Afghan allies claim to have what's called a U.S. tie. And they arrive at a time where the job market is great, but where the housing market is really, really bad. It's very tight across the country. It's incredibly expensive. Historically, over the last several decades, many of the Afghans who have arrived have settled either in the Sacramento area, other communities near Sacramento, or Northern California, Northern Virginia. And so many of them would like to go to those places. These are incredibly difficult housing markets. We have hundreds of communities across the country which look forward to welcoming our allies from Afghanistan. And so what we essentially had to say was, if your U.S. tie will house you, that's one thing. But if they won't house you, we have lots of communities across the country. So here's how it works. There are 9 big resettlement agencies. Their names are like the International Rescue Committee, the Conference of Catholic Bishops, the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. In fact, a woman who splits her time between Delaware and Maryland, Krish Vignaraj O'Mara, runs that one. There's the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society. The Ethiopians have one. There are 9 in total. Episcopalians have one. There are 9 in total. I should know if the Presbyterians specifically have one, but I can't say. But so there are 9. They have 200 affiliates across the country. 5 years ago, they had 300 affiliates. But there were so few refugees allowed in during the previous administration that the refugee resettlement sector was decimated. So these resettlement agencies and these 200 affiliates at the local level are simultaneously rebuilding their capacity while they're also handling what will be the biggest resettlement effort in their lifetimes. So what happens is these local affiliates work. 49 of the 50 states have a state refugee coordinator who typically, but not always, works for the governor. And they work in tandem to determine what is the capacity of the local community to resettle our allies. It's not as easy as just saying we're going to send the next 200 of our allies to Portland. And the reason for that is because it's literally, does the school district have the capacity to take in this particular family, perhaps one of the children has autism, and is the housing suitable? Maybe the mom has MS. And so the house either needs to be a ranch or the apartment building needs to have an elevator. That's the kind of conversation and thought that has to go into it. So what happens is at the military bases, the State Department, their bureau is called the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, works closely with the Department of Health and Human Services as the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And they work with they work with these local communities, and the local communities have to work with landlords, with employers, with the health system, with the schools, and with the local community. So in the case here in Westminster, you're working, I think, with the local Islamic community as well as with Congregation Beth Shalom. And this is what it takes. And it has been amazing to see. I've had the chance over the last couple of months, I've been to Kansas City and to Tulsa and to Oklahoma City and to Houston and Lansing, Michigan and Albany and Virginia a couple of times. And the places that do it well tend to be the places where folks are connected with each other. In Oklahoma's a very red state. In Oklahoma, in 2020, they resettled a total of 26 people. This year, in 2021, over a 5-month period, they were resettling 1,850 Afghans alone. Mind-boggling. And I got in both Oklahoma City and Tulsa, the local resettlement agency is Catholic Charities. And so I went to both communities, and both communities had listening sessions for me. And around the table, like 30 people, they had everybody you could imagine. And they trust each other. They work together. In Tulsa, when a lot of volunteers were starting to bring furniture and other things to help the Afghans get set up in their new homes. And so many people were coming, they had to open a warehouse. And Catholic Charities let the community know that they needed volunteers, and within a couple days, 1,000 people signed up to volunteer. It was amazing. And so they then, they get assigned to these communities. It takes longer than anybody would like. It takes longer than the Afghans would like because they're anxious to rebuild. Nobody would want, as great a job as the Department of Defense, our military has done at these bases, nobody would want us to be spending the winter at any of these military bases. But there is also, there's only so much capacity, in terms of sending people to the airport at 10 o'clock at night to make sure that there's a hot meal awaiting them in their apartment. Traditionally, when it comes to resettlement, people are able there's plenty of time that we know when they're coming. They go directly into their ultimate home. In this case, many of our allies have had to spend many weeks in a hotel or in a corporate-style apartment. And that's something that we're working at the local level with landlords and the like to try to free up capacity. So we have people going on to the military bases to try to capture the skill sets and the education level and the experiences to try to connect them to jobs. And not surprisingly, our allies arrive with a huge range of skills. Some are incredibly skilled, pilots and engineers and doctors, and they speak English really, really well. And others arrive and they're not literate in Pashto or Dari themselves. And so it's a huge range. Some of the kids, when I went to Lansing, some of these states do an incredible job with the school system in terms of being ready to accept folks from other countries. They're not mainstreamed on day one. They're sort of, they're in a place with other kids where they can really learn the language intensively, and then they might be mainstreamed in a few months, maybe half a day. But some of these families, the kids had not been in school before. Some were incredibly well prepared, so it's a huge variation.
That's fascinating, and you answered a couple of questions that I was going to ask in there about some of the challenges around language when folks get here, and sort of matching skills and experience to jobs. I do want to dive in, and you've touched on it a couple of times. One of the things you said is it's so awe-inspiring to see the generosity. It reminds me of when I talk about running for office. I say if you want to fall deeper in love with your community, run for office, because you will see this generosity that pours out from places that you might, based on your own preconceived biases, least expect it. And it sounds like you're seeing that as well on a national level. And you also talked about sort of seeing this response transcend red and blue. And it certainly seemed like in the early days during the evacuation that there was a broad-based bipartisan consensus around the need to welcome Afghans to the United States. Has that consensus continued? And both from the public and from elected officials, are you seeing a willingness to welcome and work across the aisle?
It has largely continued, and I give 99% of the credit to our community of veterans. Our veterans they are the most compelling, authentic, and powerful voice about our obligation to provide the safe and dignified welcome to our allies from Afghanistan, because they know they were together. Our allies put their lives on the line, many of them. And so because of that, it's very difficult. This is not 100%, because we do have, some politicians who are much less enthusiastic about this effort. But it's pretty difficult when our veterans are so clear for elected officials to go against them. And, I have long felt that one of the most important things for us to do in this effort is to make sure we continue to win the hearts and minds of the American people. And that has largely been true. It's not exclusively true. But for the most part, I've been very, very encouraged by it.
So on that note, obviously whenever we have conversations about refugees or asylum seekers or immigration writ large, there's obviously pockets of fear. Fear around change, fear around competition, fear around the unknown. And I'm curious, in your role, have you had to navigate that fear, and what has been your strategy if you've faced that?
Well, because the job market is so good, there's less of the, it's a zero-sum game, and if they take my job, it's one less job for me, because, there are so many jobs available, and we're very fortunate for that. I think there is generally a lack of understanding of the differences in culture, and there are lots of differences in the culture, and I think there's a lot of effort spent, both at the military bases as well as in local communities, at making sure that the Afghans understand the expectations in this country and what our system of laws looks like. And the communities that do it well also spend time educating the local communities about the lives and the cultures and the lived experiences of our allies from Afghanistan. Because as with anything else, it comes down to communication. And when we understand each other, it's more likely that we're going to get along. So, I think we see the concerns, and the best that we can do is make sure everybody understands each other to the greatest degree.
One thing you mentioned earlier was about the prioritization of pregnant women and folks with higher medical needs. I'm curious how you have grappled with, obviously your focus has been primarily domestically in terms of once folks are here, but are you also grappling with some of the conversations that we hear around Afghans who are particularly at risk because of identity, because of particular community affiliation or backgrounds? Have you had to navigate that space?
That's really more, I'd say there has been some of that, and I think some of the advocacy groups and community groups have been good allies. We've been very much the beneficiaries of outreach from the Afghan American diaspora. Give you a specific example, we have a couple of hundred unaccompanied minors. Most of the unaccompanied minors are reunited quickly, either with family, parents or close relatives, but we have a couple hundred who are still in the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And so we've had a lot of interest on the part of the Afghan American diaspora to become foster parents, either to be able to adopt or to become foster parents to the kids who are here unaccompanied. And so I've now spoken with one governor, I've got another one tomorrow, in the communities where we have identified Afghan American parents who want to adopt or to be foster parents, to make sure that the state bureaucracy is not getting in the way. So that's sort of one specific example.
You've mentioned a couple of different communities that have particularly compelling examples of various aspects of successful resettlement. I'm curious if you could dive into that a little bit more about communities that are standing out to you in this process, what they are doing best, what have been sort of really creative approaches that folks have taken that you hope other communities replicate.
So if we back up and say the most important thing we can do is set people up for long-term success, what does that mean? Well, it means that people are put in a stable home as quickly as possible. One of the advantages of having this work done at the local level is these local communities generally have better ties with landlords who may be willing, and who, once they understand the general history of refugees, paying for their rent, or understand the array of federal resources that are available, they'll be more likely to, be willing to provide the housing. Jobs, we've had really extraordinary outreach from employers across the country. Transportation is a big issue, particularly in a place like Kansas City, which is sprawling, or Houston, which is sprawling. The resettlement agencies, which are connecting the dots between where is there safe, affordable housing that is proximate to public transportation, so folks can get to work. But do they understand how the public transportation works? So I mean, it is the very simple things like, how does public transportation work? I'm going to walk the newly arrived Afghans into the school. I'm going to sit down with them, with the principal, with the guidance counselor. I'm going to make sure that they are set up with a buddy. The police departments are engaged and are talking with the Afghans both about, here are the expectations in our country, and by the way, if you are feeling any kind of discrimination, if there are threats made against you, here's how you deal with it, here's who you call. The healthcare system. I mean, imagine going to a place where you don't speak the language. The healthcare system is totally different than anything you've ever experienced. And so is somebody taking me in to meet the doctor, the nurse practitioner, the dentist, explaining anesthesia. I mean, it could be any of these things. And so I think the communities that do it well, are really looking at this from the perspective of the people that we are trying to serve, and are creative and bring in, like the YWCA, I mentioned the YMCA or YWCA in Tulsa, they're not officially part of the resettlement effort, but the local resettlement agency reached out to them to say, can you provide this service or that service? The other thing that I should mention that we've done, historically in the U.S., resettlement has always been done through these 9 big resettlement agencies. But there is limited capacity. So we've introduced 2 new concepts, thanks to the remarkable advocacy and creativity of just regular people around the country. One is something that we call sponsor circles, and this launched maybe 6 weeks ago, where groups of 5 individuals or more can choose to sponsor a family from Afghanistan, separate from the local resettlement agency, which means they are taking on a real obligation on housing, on jobs, on all the things that we just mentioned. And those 5 individuals and those that they recruit are the ones on the job, and they do not have the support of resettlement agencies. So already a number of families have been resettled. My favorite story is one of these sponsoring groups is a group of Vietnamese folks who themselves were refugees years ago and who saw, who understand the power of resettlement. So that's one effort. And the other one is more of institutional partnership, where big groups, big civic groups, are sort of under the tutelage of a resettlement agency, taking on hundreds or thousands of families themselves, starting really more in the hundreds. But Samaritan's Purse is an example. Islamic Relief is an example. There are a number of examples like that we'll be hearing more about.
One area that I don't think we've talked about, we've talked about healthcare, but one area that I don't think we've talked about, and forgive me if I missed it, is around the mental health care for folks who are resettling. Obviously, there's a lot of trauma, both in the evacuation, but then a lot of trauma potentially in resettling entirely in a new place, new language. How have you thought about making sure that folks are getting the mental health care?
Yeah, no, and I should have mentioned that because it's certainly one of the absolute top needs, and one of the things that makes it particularly challenging is language. There's just a relative shortage of translators, and there are really 3 languages: Dari, Pashto, and Farsi. And then there's so many unmet mental health needs in the country generally. So this is something that's primarily done at the local level. The Office of Refugee Resettlement does provide some resources to support that, but it is a huge need we're trying to address, but still there's a ton of work to do.
It's a challenge. I mean,
it's a huge
what
challenge.
an incredible matrix of services, both public and private. So looking forward, you've mentioned there are still folks that still need to be resettled in communities or still on bases. What does this operation look like moving forward in the months and even years ahead? How long will there be this sort of centralized operation to make sure that folks are getting the support that they need?
I think in the, sometime soon, again, the White House's involvement in this is pretty unusual. And I think what the aim will be to get to more regular order through the Department of State and Homeland Security and the others. But for some time, the guy who was a deputy, I have to say I don't know much about the federal government. And when I was asked to do this in late August, my first reaction was, "You've got to be kidding me." That was not the language I used, but I went and I spoke to the folks who asked me to do this, and I said, "I'll do it, but I don't really know much about the federal government, and you've got to help me put together a great team." And so it was astonishing it is astonishing how talented the people at the National Security Council and the White House and other agencies are. And so the deputy on my team is a guy, he's a career Foreign Service officer he's detailed to the National Security Council. He's in charge of all refugee issues. I mean, just brilliant. And the rest of the team is the same way. So they will continue for some period of time, and they're working closely with our veterans groups and others who are particularly concerned about getting more people out of Afghanistan. But I'm hopeful that at some point, later, I can't put a time frame on it, it'll get back closer to regular order, because the people at the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration at the State Department, the people at the Office of Refugee Resettlement at Human Health and Human Services are remarkable people. I mean, I wish that the American people could see what I have seen in terms of the dedication and the competence of the people within the U.S. government, as well as what I talked about before, just the generosity of the American people. At a time when we are so divided and there's just so much vitriol and there's so much toxicity, generally, this has been like just such an inspiring thing to be a part of.
Well, I wish.
And that, by the way, it doesn't mean it's easy. And there are still massive challenges with all of this, but to see how the American people respond to it.
I wish the media covered it in the same way that they covered some of those early days.
Yeah.
But obviously, a well-run, although logistically complicated program doesn't get the same kind of media attention as sometimes negative coverage does.
We've gotten great local press across the country, and the national press, I think, has actually been pretty balanced. I mean, there have been some tough stories, but it's understandable. So they cover people who have been on these military bases for several months. None of us would be happy to be on these military bases for several months, and so they tell those stories. But I think for the most part, it's been pretty fair.
Good. You are now moving to a different role, as we've talked about. But this issue, even if Operation Allies Welcome disbands as a centralized White House coordinator position, these issues are cyclical, they don't go away. If there is a future need for a person, a White House coordinator for a future refugee resettlement program, what would your advice be to that person?
Well, hopefully there wouldn't be, because there is a system set up, the refugee resettlement system. I mean, it was decimated during the previous administration. President Biden has increased the number of refugees that he believes the country should resettle to 125,000 a year. That's basically, by the way, that's on top of the Afghans specifically. And so, if the funding's there, the system works. I think we have introduced these new innovations. I think this idea, and these were not my innovations, these sponsor circles and the institutional sponsorship. These came from others, and I think, but we were willing to listen, and the other agencies within the U.S. government were willing to listen and participate. So I think you have to, as with everything else, not think that anybody has a monopoly on good ideas. And there are a lot of, and I always believed when I was governor, I would always say, we don't have a monopoly on good ideas in the governor's office, and without disrespect, I didn't think the legislature had a monopoly on good ideas. It may now, if you're there.
That's right, I'm always right, I'm always right.
But I think, when you're willing to listen and be open and tap into, there are a lot of really smart people. And again, I think I've now had at least 3, maybe 4 conversations over the last few months with leaders of the Afghan American diaspora. The great thing about being at the White House, of course, is that when you say you're at the White House and you want to talk, anybody will talk. And so, if we have a conversation with leaders of the Afghan American diaspora, we'll get 40 people across the country who want to offer their 2 cents. And generally their 2 cents, like on this issue about foster parents and adoption, just makes a ton of sense.
Well, it sounds like hopefully you've institutionalized a lot of changes that will also prevent a future need for this kind of role as well. So we've got a couple minutes left. I'd love to open it up for questions from our wonderful audience.
Our wonderful audience and Charlie, is that what that is? Yeah, I'll repeat the question. The question is, what is the magnitude of the issue in terms of how many folks still in Afghanistan will be getting out? So I'm less involved in this. I can sort of address it at a very high level. There's a lot of work that's been going on over the last few months to prioritize those populations. From the beginning, the president said, understandably, wants to get all American citizens out. And I'm pretty sure that every American citizen who wants to get out is out. That's at least, I think, the last thing I heard. There are people who qualified for the special immigrant visas. These are folks who worked for us, with us in Afghanistan for at least a minimum period of time. That's very high on the list. There are people there who were at risk because maybe they were women's rights activists. They were working for non-government organizations. There's that population. There are the family members of these groups. And then of course, there's family reunification of those who have arrived. And so, I mean, I can't say what that number is, but the way that it's being thought about is sort of, how to prioritize, and those are some of the main groups that are being prioritized.
Okay, all systems go, so pass the mic.
First of all, thank you for being here today and explaining the program. What is the difference in process and classification between Afghan refugees and the people from Central America who are trying to cross into our country through the southern border? How are those two groups handled?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about the latter group, and I should clarify. The Afghans are not actually refugees. And I quickly get over my head if I talk about refugee legal status, but let me just try a little bit. The folks who are here as special immigrant visa holders, they arrive with a very clear path to citizenship. We believe that in excess of 40% of the Afghans who have arrived are eligible for that special immigrant visa status. Not all of them arrived with it, because, for example, I'll give you a couple of examples. A woman who worked for the State Department in Afghanistan, for our State Department in Afghanistan, she worked for us for 23 months. The law used to be you had to work for us for 2 years. The law changed to 1 year. She didn't know it, so she didn't qualify for special immigrant visa status, but she's eligible for it. Met another guy who worked for us for 5 years. He said, I didn't apply for the SIV status because I never planned to leave Afghanistan. I didn't want to leave my mother. He's eligible for it. Met other guys who said, we didn't apply for it because we were off fighting the Taliban. So some of that processing is now happening here. The reason this is important, though, is because many of the folks who have arrived don't have a special immigrant visa status. There had been two implications to that. Number one, that meant until the end of September, they would not qualify for the array of federal resources that the SIV holders qualify for, and that would have been a nightmare because it meant essentially they would have had no funding, and we were really worried about what that could mean for local communities across the country, but fortunately Congress passed and the President signed legislation to make sure that they were eligible for the same kinds of resources. However, the negative side of it, the administration sought for the technical term for this population that does not have SIV status, they were admitted under the terms of humanitarian parole. That is not a refugee. And what it means is that they do not have a clear pathway to citizenship. The administration sought it, Congress did not go along. And this is a battle that is going to have to continue to be fought, because the general process for asylum seekers is really messed up. It's incredibly long. And so this is one of the huge unsolved issues affecting a big part of this population. There are plenty of people who know about it and who are working on it. A lot of communities across the country are providing free pro bono legal services to help folks apply for the appropriate pathway to status, but this is something that's still a huge issue. I just don't know enough about the situation at the southern border to comment on.
Other questions?
Governor, you mentioned earlier that the refugees, not refugees, but the people who were taken out of Afghanistan and went to bases in the Middle East and Europe were checked against databases for security purposes. Have you any idea how many were rejected based on that analysis, and what happened to those people?
Very few, but if the green light did not pop up, they were not allowed to fly into the country. And by the way, at that time, the U.S. government sent 400 officers from Customs and Border Protection to those military bases in Europe and the Middle East to provide that level of scrutiny. When they arrived, either at Dulles or Philadelphia, they went through the same process again. If something different popped up for some reason, again, they would not be allowed into the country. So I don't know the numbers, relatively few, but some, which showed that the process was working. They were, I don't know how much of this is I can really talk about. There are arrangements made with some other places for a period of time to hold them while the scrutiny continues.
Any other questions?
I'm wondering, and I don't know, Sarah, maybe you would weigh in on this too. What's happening in Delaware statewide in terms of the resettlement effort?
The local affiliate, remember I talked about these 200 local affiliates across the country. The local affiliate is Jewish Family Services, which operates under the purview of one of the Big Nine. And the Big Nine that Jewish Family Services is affiliated with is called the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, or HIAS. I want to say that Delaware is welcoming in the neighborhood of 45 Afghans. I think most of them have arrived. I know a number of them are down in Newark. The university has provided housing. I know this because my entire TV room has been cleared out of furniture by Carla, and it's now in Newark, as well as a punching bag that they wanted. So, but you know, and I've heard from some of the volunteers. They seem to be doing a great job, and I don't know what the situation with the families here at Westminster, but if it's part of the regular process, I would think that Jewish Family Service is involved in that. I'm seeing Craig is nodding his head. Thank you. So that's generally what's going on in Delaware. I don't know a lot in Delaware. I should. I don't know what the situation is with the schools. That might be something for you to look into, because I really I've been incredibly impressed. I mentioned Lansing, Michigan. I've mentioned Texas, and to see what they do. By the way, I do want to share a couple of stories if I can.
Yeah.
The Afghans that I have met, you know, and I've met a lot, and I asked them to tell me their story about their life in Afghanistan, about their travel to the country, the good, the bad, and the ugly. and there's some of everything. And I asked this, this is in Oklahoma City, I met a mom and dad, 5 kids and 6 on the way. And I asked, what's been your biggest surprise? And they said, their biggest surprise is we envisioned that life in America would be too good to be true, and life in America is too good to be true. And this is a family that's still in a hotel. We met a mom, really a challenging situation. Mom is 26 years old. She's got 3 kids, and she is here with her 6-year-old. She was separated through this unbelievable set of circumstances, and her husband and the 4-year-old and 2-year-old are in Abu Dhabi, hopefully on their way soon. And I asked her the same question, and she said when she arrived at Fort Bliss in Texas, she was so overwhelmed by the soldiers and the service that they provide. She said that I realized that's the kind of service that I want to provide someday. I met a pilot in Albany. This is a pilot who had been to the U.S. before because he had been in Texas for training. And he said that he had planned to go to be resettled in Texas. He ended up in Albany. He says, but now I want to stay in Albany. I said, why do you want to stay in Albany? And he pointed to the caseworkers and the neighbors seated next to him. And he said, because I feel so welcome here by Julie and Catherine. And it is just hard to overstate the importance of that welcome. And that's, I think, places, a place where congregations like Westminster can excel. You may not have all the technical expertise, to know about every aspect of resettlement, but what you can be is you can provide a welcome in a way that others perhaps may have more difficulty with. And so I think there's something really to be said for that personal touch. These folks are going through a lot. I met a family, mom, dad, both about 30 years old, 4-year-old, 2-year-old, in Lansing, Michigan. It was cold. And I said, had you ever heard of Michigan before? He said, no, we hadn't heard of Lansing, we hadn't heard of Michigan. We'd only heard of LA and New York, but now we want to stay in Lansing. And for the same kind of reason. And so it's, I think, truly remarkable what that welcome can mean. I think we're starting.
I was going to say, I think on that, it's a great note to end on. I'm heartened to hear about the grace and goodness that you're seeing in so many places from both the Afghans that we're welcoming and the Americans who are welcoming them. And I think on that note of how we can continue to serve and contribute to this cause is a great note to end on. So please join me in thanking Governor Markell, Ambassador His Excellency Jack Markell.